is, what was the purpose of building a railing around your roof?
What was the biblical punishment for not doing that?
There wasn't one, but it was a
Sin, maybe,
requirement.
instead of crime. Yeah, that's true.
Okay, it was a requirement. Everybody know what I'm talking about?
So someone couldn't fall off your roof.
Right. So, what did that do? How did it work? Stephen?
You provided the means so that it was hard to fall off.
Right.
Instead of it being easy, and you made it so it wasn't easy to fall off, but if they fell off and you had taken all the necessary precautions, then
That's right. So if you didn't put a railing around your roof, you were liable for the death of that person, or whatever the injury was to that person that actually fell off your roof. What was the penalty if nobody fell off your roof, if you didn't have one? There wasn't one. Okay? So what that did, you could argue that it was a zoning law which protected not the person who was going to fall off the roof, but actually protected the homeowner. So think about how that would impact zoning laws today. Right? So instead of if you didn't do something that the zoning law said, you wouldn't be automatically a criminal, but you would be a criminal if in fact you didn't do it and there were consequences associated with it. You would be liable, fully liable. So the railing around the roof had the effect of limiting the liability of the homeowner.
Another effect is that it gave you an incentive to do the right thing without forcing you to do so.
Right. Yep. Okay. So I mean, there is justification for some of these kinds of things, so that government can do some things which will limit liability, but also be that which will, in a sense, protect. And so we need to be careful in terms of how we do that. And I would say the same thing about, for example, drug testing. Right, the FDA. Same kind of thing could be used there. Right? Companies could put the drugs they want on the market, but if somebody dies, guess what? You're responsible for murder, if you knew it. Okay?
So you're saying that all our zoning laws now are appropriate biblical exercises of...
No, because if you violate your zoning law today, you're automatically a criminal, and you can be put in jail or fined or whatever. Whereas the biblical model was, no, you're not automatically a criminal.
Or not allowed to do whatever you want to do in the first instance.
All right.
I'm representing a church up in Hood River that wants to expand in their current location, and the building is big enough for them to expand into adjoining space, but they're not allowed to do it because the zoning laws prohibit it. Even though the landlord wants them to do it, the church wants to do it, but the city says no.
So the building is big enough, all they have to do is remove some walls,
Yes.
and they are being told no. No structural changes,
Right.
no nothing.
Whose property is it?
The landlord is...
Yeah, it belongs to
Okay.
a private owner.
Okay. Now, let's go on to national defense briefly, which is really an extension of the protection of life, person, and property. So national defense is a responsibility of the nation. And I apologize, I gave you a bad reference here. And it should have been from Judges 2:16, not Joshua 2:16, sorry. But also Romans 13. And basically what Judges 2:16 says is that then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of those who plundered them. Okay? But one of the ones I wanted to bring up to you, because it's kind of interesting, and that is, somebody mentioned it earlier, the example of Abram and Lot. Remember when Lot moves to Sodom and Gomorrah, and the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah are taken captive and their property taken, and does Abraham go to the government and say, guess what, you got to take care of this? No. He says, get your guns, guys. Right? We're going after Lot. Now, do you know that there's actually a modern example of this? Within the last 50 years? Very interesting book, written by Ken Follett, called On the Wings of Eagles. Okay? True story. And I won't get the timeline exactly right, but it was around the time in Iran where the Shah was going to be taken out of power. And a guy whose name you all know, a guy by the name of Ross Perot, at the time, Ross Perot had started a company, founded a company called EDS Data Systems, Electronic Data Systems. Huge company, became a huge computer company. He made billions of dollars, millions of dollars, I don't know, billions, lots of money, okay? He was the head of the company at that time. Two of his vice presidents were in Iran, and they were accused of bribery, which they were not guilty of. And of course, there was a lot of civil unrest in Iran. Perot was very concerned about his two men. So what did he do?
He sent people to get them.
He sent people, mercenaries, in to get them and to take them out. If by force, out of prison, if necessary. And they were successful. Interesting book to read, On Wings of Eagles. And it just occurred to me this week as I was thinking about Lot and Abram, that there's an example of a man who took responsibility, put his own company's funds into the process of rescuing those he was responsible for. Okay, didn't wait for the government. And we all know how that would have worked out, given how it's worked out for other people.
Yeah.
Right? So I just thought that was a good example. And we don't think about those things happening in modern times, but for all of the negatives about Ross Perot, I've always admired him for his willingness to do that. And interestingly enough, he hired a guy who had been a special forces guy in Vietnam to lead the team. But several of the men who were on the team were men who had been in the military and who were special forces, but who were now working for him at EDS. So in a sense, he got his servants, if you will, together and funded them and sent them into Iran. Yeah, Stephen?
I would also put defense in the role of the family and or the individual, because that is the whole point in the Second Amendment.
Well, it's also the principle behind the idea of self-defense. You have the right to protect your own life.
You have the right to protect your life, and you have the right to protect the life of other people.
And the thing about it is that the point of this is that these are all things which exist primarily here and are delegated here legitimately. All right, and again, that's the whole idea that the founders had of natural rights. Every right or every responsibility that was given to the government was a responsibility that was first assumed that they, the people, had themselves, in themselves. Okay? And therefore, that's how they could, in fact, delegate it. You can't delegate something that's not yours to begin with. Well, you can try. Okay?
Tell that to the government right now.
Yeah. The next one was standard weights and measures. Who has the responsibility for standards of weights and measures?
Government. But everybody does. We are responsible to God.
And I'll just write this as standards. All right? I think it's a legitimate function of government to say, here's what a pound is, or here's what a kilogram is, or here's what a dollar is.
That include the dollar too?
It should.
Yeah.
Would you like to have the kilogram float? Or the pound float?
I'm going to
Or if you're a
work out this
pharmacist, right? Would you like a milligram to float?
I think the pound already does float.
Different kind of pound. Pound sterling is what you're talking about.
Isn't it really tie back to like the perjury and deceit and bearing false witness? Saying this is something and it's not that.
In a sense, yes.
Failing
If you wanted to draw a line back to one of the 10 Commandments, which for everything you really should be able to do,
Right.
it would go back to the issue of you shall not steal or bear
And
false witness.
bearing false witness.
Okay. Okay. Somebody else had a hand up. No? How about the issue of immigration? Stephen?
I have absolutely no problem with immigration.
You have no problem with it?
No.
In what sense? What do you mean?
Illegal immigration I have a definite problem with. We need to be able to allow, I have no problem with bringing the best and brightest from India, China, all the people who would benefit the country and make us a more profitable society. However, I have no interest in letting the gazillions of migrant workers from Mexico come in and take the jobs that could be much better put to use here, and then support them with the tax money that we aren't getting from the people who aren't working here.
What's the biblical model? Stacy?
It seems like, if I understand correctly, that Ruth, being a Moabitess, was still willing to glean in the fields of the area. I mean, she would have been willing to work for her mother-in-law's support.
Right.
And that the alien was allowed to, and I don't think that they had a definition of whether they were educated or not. The alien was allowed to come into Israel.
Well, she was-
as long as they were following Israel's rules.
Right. You had to be careful with Ruth, because Ruth was, in fact, a legal immigrant by virtue of her marriage.
Yes, right, yeah.
Okay.
Right.
But what were the immigration rules for Israel? Tim?
At least one of them that I am familiar with is, if a slave comes and is living among you, do not turn him over to his master.
Okay. Okay, that was one of them. Any others?
Property
think-
rights were still considered Israelite owned.
That's right. The alien really could not own land in Israel, just because it was all allocated already. All right, Stephen?
By virtue of that, he was not able to vote.
Well, not by virtue of the fact he didn't own property, but by virtue of the fact he was not a member of the assembly or a member of the congregation.